United States history, the mistreatment of minorities has been blatantly evident. From enslaving them to imprisoning them, and even just plainly treating them as invalids, non-white Americans have faced hard times. Some of these groups include Native Americans, Asian Americans, homosexual Americans, disabled Americans, and Latino Americans.
Although Hispanic presence in the United States existed as early as the 16th century before the country was even formed, the many social issues that would plague Hispanics throughout the course of the United States did not arise until much later. Modern-day Texas belonged under Mexican control for many years, as early as 1691, when it was part of Spain. However, in 1839, the Texans declared independence from the Mexican government, and in 1845, Texas was annexed to the United States. This would be the beginning of the plight of Hispanic Americans in the United States. On Mexico, and in 1849, they eventually won the war and were granted large portions of the Mexican Southwest that would eventually become part of the United States. The Homestead Act of 1862 caused many Americans to make their way west, interfering with the traditionally Hispanic homelands that they now lived in. This would cause several major social problems between white settlers and Hispanic citizens for years to come. During World War II, Hispanic Americans actually made up the largest proportion of active servicemen. However, they faced continued discrimination at home in the form of the Zoot Suit riots when white American servicemen attacked Hispanic Americans in Los Angeles. In the years following World War II, thousands of Cuban immigrants would make their way to the U.S., while Cesar Chavez would also fight for primarily Hispanic migrant workers' rights. Despite attempts at curbing Hispanic immigration, such as Operation Wetback, Hispanic population in the United States continued to grow, and as of 2014, they constitute the second largest group within the United States.
Homosexual history is relatively short compared to other minorities. During the 1860s and 70s, European public administrators began noticing that some people were organizing their lives around various forms of sexual pleasure. Alarmed, officials began studying these populations, whom they characterized as sexual deviants, of which some came to be known as homosexuals. In the United States, the history of homosexual culture and politics is even shorter than it is in Europe. Those with homosexual inclinations found one another at the same time they found freedom to express themselves without ever-present familial and religious disapproval. For women in particular, this was a new experience. The people of the United States did not like this new trend. For a while, it was even considered a disease. Immigrants were banned from the United States if they have psychopathic personality, which included homosexuality. The fear affected even on the government level. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered dismissal of all federal employees guilty of sexual perversion. As with other minorities, the 60s seemed to spawn progress for these peoples. In 1962, Illinois became the first state in the United States to decriminalize homosexual acts between consenting adults in private. And in 1963, the American Civil Liberties Union opposed government interference in the private sex lives of consenting adults. In the early 70s, the American Psychiatric Association finally removed homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders, and the U.S. Civil Service Commission stopped banning gay men and lesbians from federal jobs. But not everyone was fond of these new changes. 80% of surveyed Oregon doctors said they would refuse to treat known homosexuals, and Arkansas recriminalized gay sex after 2 years without such a law. Homosexuals in America are having. Even in modern-day times, there are still conflicts. In 2008, 15-year-old Lawrence King was shot and killed after a chat with his friends. King, an 8th grader who identified as gay, occasionally wearing makeup and high heels to school, was shot in the head while at school. Now, in 2014, the United States Supreme Court blocked any further same-sex marriages, while Utah officials appealed a decision by Judge Shelby the previous years. A few days later, the Obama administration announced that the federal government would recognize the marriages of 1,000 same-sex couples in Utah, but the resistance is still evident. As far as other minorities, homosexuals have come a long way in a far shorter period of time, but religion and conservative mindsets are still altering their equality today.
The American Federation of the Physically Handicapped, formed by Paul Strachan to end job discrimination against physically handicapped people and lobbied for legislation. In 1946, the National Mental Health Foundation was formed to expose the terrible conditions of mental institutes during World War II. Following, in 1947, the Paralyzed Vets of America was formed. The Social Security amendments made federal state programs to aid permanently and totally disabled persons in America. In 1954, the Vocational Rehabilitation Amendments were federal grants to expand programs available to people with physical disabilities. In 1954, the PL 83761, also known as the Social Security Act Amendment, protected employees who were forced to leave because of disabilities. The Community Mental Health Act was passed in 1963, which provided funding for developmental research centers in universities and community facilities for the mentally disabled. This shows the increasing attempts to accommodate for the mentally disabled people of America. In 1965, Medicare and the Voting Rights Act was passed. The Voting Rights Act allowed severely disabled people to get help on voting as long as it wasn't their boss or union agent. In the Wyatt and Sticky case of 1971, the federal court ruled that disabled people were no longer to be locked away in custodial institute without treatment or education. In 1972, the Mills v. Board of Education case ruled that all kids with any type of disability were entitled to free public education. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act prohibited discrimination of disabled people in federal services and programs. In 1978, the Title VII of Rehabilitation Act was the first federal funding for consumer-controlled independent living centers. In 1979, the Rogers v. Oken case ruled that competent patient committed to psychiatric hospital has the right to refuse treatment in non-emergencies. In 1990, the Americans with Disability Acts granted Civil Rights Act for disabled people. In 1995, the American Association of People with Disabilities was founded. In 2008, Americans with Disabilities Act broadened the scope of who can receive benefits. In 2011, the Act extended the accessibility of swimming pools, golf courses, boating facilities, and other public facilities for the physically handicapped. Recently, in 2013, the consent to work paper that was required for people with disabilities was not required for government jobs anymore. Overall, disabled people in America have seen progress. It can be shown through the multiple court cases, federal grants, and laws that passed that helped support the disabled people of America.
Asian American history is more widely known than these other groups. When they first entered the United States, they were tolerated. However, after mass Asian migrations during the Gold Rush period, anti-immigration laws were widespread enacted. As the United States increased contact with Japan, more Japanese sought life in America, but were in turn interned into concentration camps solely because of the anti-Asian mentality America possessed. The federal racism persisted until the Second World War when the laws were repealed and entrance was made slightly easier, a time period known for improvement of most minorities. Today, societal acceptance of Asians is almost full as they assimilate and play a large part in American culture.
Native American history is also fairly well known. When the Europeans arrived in the Americas, Native Americans were fascinated by them. Unfortunately, the European feeling was not mutual, and consequently the natives were treated as inferior. They were relocated, dominated, and killed in order to make way for European expansion. When tobacco became the staple crop of the Americas, who was around but the subjugated Indians to take on all the work? As time went on, Native Americans fought hard to keep their lands, engaging in famous battles and wars, but were continuously conquered. Soon they became residents of reservations and subject of unkept promises from the federal government. Unlike most minority groups in the Americas, treatment of the Native Americans never seemed to improve. Today the culture is valued and worshipped, but not dominant, as most tribes were eliminated. It's hard to generalize the treatment of all American minorities, as they were not all treated the same. Asians were long scrutinized, but are now mostly accepted. Homosexuals continue to gain growing societal acceptance, but face massive opposition from heavy religionists who see the lifestyle as immoral. Latino Americans fought their way into America, and now constitute a large portion of it, especially in the Southwest. Disabled Americans did face laws against them, but rather than treating them with attitudes of condescendence, America continues to make accommodations to help them with their natural-born struggle. Finally, Native Americans never saw a happy ending. Most were killed, but the descendants value and spread the love as a reminder that we cannot let this tragedy occur again. Learning about the treatment of minorities is important in understanding American culture and acceptance today.